It has been a long time, but the hardcore lines on maps are back, and now they are headed across the world. You know about the US naval deployments to the region, of course, but the conversations about the deployments tend to misinterpret what is happening in the broader course of negotiations. Either that, or the conversations overlook those negotiations altogether. So, before a war potentially breaks out, let's take a step back today and explore what exactly the US mobilization intends to accomplish. The apparent mismatch between what is happening in the Caribbean versus in closed-door negotiations. The structural issue with negotiating with an autocrat like Nicolas Maduro over issues like these, it's called a commitment problem, and the narrow way in which one might get out of said commitment problem. But let's start with the purpose of the mobilization, because that is subject to all sorts of political mumbo-jumbo. And at the risk of tapping my sign, don't listen to what leaders say, watch what they do. I do not think that any of us should doubt that Trump wants Maduro gone. Now, we could talk a bit about where that desire is coming from. Hint, it seems to be from this guy, or Secretary of State Marco Rubio, for those of you listening while walking your dogs. But explaining the White House power struggle that has gotten us here would require an entirely separate video. Maybe next time. The point is that it is usually not difficult to ascertain what leaders want. Putin wants Ukraine. Xi wants Taiwan. You get the idea. The tricky part is understanding the price that leaders are willing to pay to obtain their goals. It is classic lines on maps stuff. The less resolved you are, the more I can extract out of you at the bargaining table. As such, less resolved actors want to feign resolve. Sometimes it works, and they get a better deal. Sometimes the opponent wrongly thinks that it is facing an unresolved country anyway, demands too much, and ends up in a 4-year special military operation. But 6 million of you already know that story. In any case, I would strongly recommend that you tune out what Trump is saying on the matter, regardless of whether he is sometimes beating his chest or sometimes acting cagey. It is all noise. Instead, focus on the Caribbean. Actual stuff is happening there, and I am not just referring to the strikes on alleged cartel boats. When the deployment first got there, my interest was piqued, and we indeed discussed the matter months ago. Well, the strikes have continued, with a new one every few days. Again, I would advise against reading too much into what is happening there. It seems that this is serving as a domestic legal basis to give Trump the authority to engage in more serious actions. Obviously, that is something in contention on Capitol Hill. And I suppose to some degree, the fact that Trump is willing to jump through those hoops is also evidence of the sincerity behind his intent. However, despite the accumulation of those strikes, and despite how the deployment was obviously too large for anti-cartel operations, it was still not large enough for me to gauge the sincerity of Trump's actions here. You see, deployments are actually costly. It is not free to send aircraft carriers, for example, on pleasure cruises around the world. They cost a ton to operate, and if they are in one place in the world, they cannot be in another place. But for a deployment to convey true credibility, there has to be significant heft behind the action. If I light $1 on fire, you might not think that I am serious. However, if I light $1 billion on fire, then that is a different story. Thus, I thought that the initial deployment was worth a mental note, but it was not big enough to draw more serious conclusions. Then the United States announced the deployment of the USS Gerald R. Ford, quite literally the world's largest naval ship and most pristine aircraft carrier ever built. That was on top of the bombers that the United States has sent from Texas and Louisiana to fly right up against Venezuela's border, only to return without incident. This is very similar to the incursions that China has been constantly doing with Taiwan, and again, we know the motivations there. Plus, we have this New York Times report, citing White House sources, that claims that Trump is seriously considering action, though he has not made a final decision. Pulling all of this together, I am now convinced that Trump is serious about taking military action in Venezuela, or at least is serious about looking serious. Please note for a few minutes from now that this does not mean that I think there will actually be military action. But the other consequence of such a buildup is that it will facilitate a better expected outcome of a war should one break out. All negotiations are centered around what the expected outcome of a war will be. It is a simple case of line moves favorably. Thus, Trump has built up some leverage and demonstrated his willingness to go further. That puts the ball in Maduro's corner. Probably a football, not a football. And I need to take a time out here, because I do not think that the media fully understands what all of this implies for crisis bargaining. As a starting point, the parties are explicitly or implicitly negotiating over three things here. One is substantive policies, including things like immigration, Russian influence in the country, and the Venezuelan government's efforts to curb cartel behavior. Second is the Maduro regime itself. And third is the graft that Maduro can accumulate while serving as president. There have been some reports that the United States is negotiating with Maduro on the substantive issues, with sanctions relief as part of the deal. Usually, the next paragraph that comes after these reports is something to the effect of, maybe Trump does not intend to attack. Well, no. I think Trump does intend to attack. The key thing to remember is that political bargaining and war are two sides of the same coin. So pardon me for getting all Karl von Clausewitz on you for a moment, but the only reason for Venezuela to negotiate with the United States here is because of the intention to invade, or engage in an air campaign, or whatever it may be. If Trump were not serious about the situation, then there is no reason to offer concessions you do not want to give. However, it tells us little about whether a war is going to happen. If I, sitting in my living room, watching the United States mobilize for a war, can conclude that this is unlikely to be a pure bluff, so can everyone else in the loop. Now, this may come as a surprise, but Maduro does not want to be the target of a US air campaign. Shocker, I know. So of course he is going to attempt to reach a deal. And I also think that Trump could plausibly accept a deal and back off, despite his intention to invade or do whatever. Remember, if your opponent is offering you concessions commensurate with the expected outcome of a war, it is better to accept them than fight a costly war just to arrive back in the same place. And for us, it shifts the topic to troubles with negotiating with someone in Maduro's position, and specifically the commitment problem that could lead to a war. Back to the three bargaining goods: the substantive policies, Maduro's regime, and Maduro's personal graft. And work with me here for a second, because this is a bit more complicated than if land is the primary commodity of interest. One thing is always easier to keep track of than the three that we now have to juggle in Venezuela. For Maduro, the important issues are the graft itself, and remaining president, because that allows him to protect his accumulated graft and promises future graft as well. The substantive issues are an afterthought. For the United States, the more important issues are the policies and Maduro's reign. But whereas Maduro views his presidency as a means to an end, the United States has long held the position that Maduro is not the legitimate president of Venezuela, and that his victories in earlier elections were fraudulent. And by long held, I mean that this predates Trump's second term. In fact, the last Venezuelan election was in March 2024, and the Biden administration refused to recognize Maduro as the winner. I think that point gets lost in the shuffle of our politically polarized world, but it is important to remember. This is not just a US thing either. There is a reason why Venezuela's main opposition leader won the Nobel Peace Prize. Actually, she's been meeting with US presidents for a long time. Now, given that breakdown of preferences, you might think that it should be easy to reach a deal. The United States cares about the substantive policy, and Maduro does not. So Maduro should concede whatever he can on that front and pacify the United States. And that seems to be where the negotiations have been centered around. However, simultaneously, it does not seem to be enough. That is what happens when one actor is much stronger than the other, and settlements must be commensurate with the balance of power. It might seem that some type of negotiation would still be possible, though. with Maduro relinquishing power to satisfy US demands. After all, Maduro cares about securing graft, and the United States does not care much about that particular issue. Heck, maybe Trump will even give him a piece of candy on his way out. Or, more generally, why not give Maduro a golden parachute and send him on his way to a nice retirement community? Well, here's the thing. Deals in principle sometimes do not work in practice. Specifically with Venezuela, the key statistic is that 41% of autocratic leaders end up exiled, jailed, or killed after their tenures end. You see, the government that would replace Maduro would almost certainly jail him. They cannot credibly commit to let bygones be bygones either, because Maduro loses all of his coercive power the moment that he steps down. As a result, the odds are much greater than 41% in this case, and jail might be the best outcome for him, because he could also get killed in the process. In fact, I would sooner bet that he departs for Moscow before seeing what happens if he stays. You know, I hear Assad has started racking up the gamer badges. Seriously. No word on whether he has switched from Balatro to Ballpit yet, but perhaps he and Maduro could start playing some duos in Fortnite? Anyway, the point is that Maduro's opponents cannot credibly commit to uphold the necessary personal concessions to Maduro that might induce him to step down. And don't at me, this is an official White House photo. Settlements may exist that would, in principle, leave both better off, but this commitment problem prevents the parties from putting them into practice. Well, with that profoundly pessimistic prognostication publicized, perhaps a path to peace may yet postpone plenty of pointless pugilism. In particular, I can see two ways that this does not devolve into war. One, this is a complicated Trump bluff. That he is serious about looking serious, but is not actually serious. I should note that the United States routinely moves its carrier groups to places with brooding conflicts that do not ultimately erupt into wars, though this one has a little bit more heft than most. This possibility will start sounding less plausible as the United States commits more materiel to the region. And that gives us a nice segue to the other possibility, that the United States accumulates so much power in the region that Maduro believes there is no hope that he will prevail in a war, at which point he flees to Moscow with whatever money he can stow away in a Swiss bank account, and then he spends his days playing a 2025 Pokemon game with 2005 graphics. Ironic, given that Putin is the one catching all of the exiled autocrats. Meanwhile, I hope to not have to write another book about this hypothetical war, so please settle for these two excellent works on the one that is ongoing. Check the video description for more information about them. And if you enjoyed today's video, then please like, share, and subscribe, and I will see you next time. Take care.